Welcome to the SportsPro Podcast.
Hi everyone and welcome once again to the SportsPro Podcast. My name is Eoin Connolly. I'm the editor-at-large at SportsPro. Hope you're well. Very happy to be back with you. Very happy to be able to welcome back once again SportsPro Managing Director Nick Meacham. Hello, Nick.
Hello, Owen. Great to be back. Never seems like there's a dull day in our industry right now. So good to catch up and chat things through.
Yeah, very much so. We were going to talk about one big media story. We're now talking about two big media stories, at least over the course of this podcast. And to help us through some of the questions around that, we have Ampere Analysis Principal Analyst Tony Maroulis. Hello, Tony.
Hi, Owen. Nice to be here.
Great to have you with us. Well, I mean, when we convened this recording, we were keen to talk about the Premier League media rights renewals here in the UK, basically rolling over the domestic rights deals they signed in 2018 to take them through another 3-year period. We are going to talk about that at the top of the podcast. We are also going to talk about the implications of some very, very big news in the world of media, the merger between WarnerMedia, currently owned by AT&T, and Discovery, two very big companies creating a very, very big company, and some other kind of conglomeration and accretion and aggregation going on across the world of legacy media as it moves into the digital age in a meaningful way. What all that's going to mean for distribution, what all that's going to mean for the way people watch and pay for content, and what that's going to mean ultimately for the sports rights market. But all that's to come. First of all, Nick, we have the Premier League rights deals here in the UK. This has been welcomed as a pretty shrewd bit of business from the Premier League, keeping Amazon, BT Sport, on whom a bit more later as well, and Sky Sports on board from, 22 to 25. And yeah, retaining that value at a point, particularly after the pandemic, where there's been a bit of a loss of confidence elsewhere in the market.
Yeah, I mean it's a huge achievement for the Premier League to pull this off. Not just because they've been able to maintain the values that they have, but also politically being able to navigate the relationships with so many different stakeholders, whether they're governmental, whether it is the broadcasters that have secured rights, and also prospective other broadcasters who may have been interested or will be interested in the future to pull this deal off. A deal of the same is a pretty incredible, I think, achievement, and to pull it off with relatively few, I guess, challenge. Well, it looks like from outside in, very few challenges or negatives being thrown at them through the mainstream media. I think for me, the question mark really is what do things look like in 3 years' time? They've bought themselves some time now to get their ship in order, hope the market resets, and hopefully, from their point of view, set themselves up in a position where they can be best placed to either see another rise in media rights again, or look at pushing what I think they will look to do, some major changes in the way they currently have their rights structured. Whether that is restructuring the current rights packages, whether it is pushing and lobbying for the 3 p.m. blackout to be removed or altered, and also the opportunity for other players in the market to potentially develop and be mature enough to start bidding. So a good achievement for them to get this over the line and keep the level of revenues the way they have and navigate that landscape. But also this really sets themselves up to give themselves a bit of time to get themselves in the best position possible 3 years from now as well.
Yeah, I mean, the one significant change of note was there is an extra 100 million that's been set aside for EFL clubs to share among their number, which is a relatively small amount of money for those 72 teams, but better than nothing, I suppose. The EFL would like that to go further, perhaps next time, and they did issue a statement saying that they would have quite appreciated the opportunity to perhaps renegotiate the way in which those funds are distributed. But as you say, bringing a lot of other stakeholders together, at a point where it's been challenging for Serie A to agree a deal. They eventually did with DAZN, but certainly there wasn't a hell of a lot of, there was the threat of a bit of discord there. And of course, in France, the situation has been a little bit more concerning with the collapse of their partnership with MediaPro. Tony, I wanted to bring you in here. Just looking at the numbers, what kind of value does this represent for the Premier League? I mean, it is a bit of an outlier when it comes to European football more generally. And of course, it probably 2 cycles ago went way, way ahead when the competition between Sky Sports and BT Sport was at its peak. And it seemed to manipulate those conditions to such a great extent that, the market has almost not caught up to the value that it got. When was that? 2015, when it made its really big leap in rights sales. What kind of position do you think this puts them in?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I think that the Premier League, this deal with the Premier League and the broadcaster is actually quite beneficial for both sides, really. I mean, you have a growing threat to some extent from OTT sports players eyeing up some of these premium tier sports rights across Europe. So obviously, you kind of mentioned DAZN in Italy buying Serie A, and obviously that caused some significant shifts. I think on top of that, if you layer in I guess the threat to some extent because it never really materialized of the European Super League, it's really quite important for the Premier League to secure their broadcasting rights and also to some extent secure those budgets, right? Again, we don't really know what the exact deals were or what discussions were made, but obviously being able to go in and say, look, like realistically, are the rights values going to shoot up the same way they did 2 cycles ago? Probably not. As you say, that was quite an outlier. I mean, even from our own research, they're probably at the right value right now, possibly a little bit overvalued, but generally speaking, in the right sort of area compared to other European leagues. But by extending the current deal, again, for the Premier League, all the sports have been under immense financial pressure because of COVID. So by securing this, keeping the process short, they've managed to basically ensure a steady supply of income to them over the next 3 years. They don't really have to find themselves in really financial difficulty, and and then whether it's steadying the ship or finding new sources of income. On the other side, from Sky, from BT's, from Amazon's perspective, of course they would love to pay less, but then there's always a risk when you go to market that someone else might come in, outbid them, prices go up, so they get the certainty too. So while kind of it's been maybe like a snooze button to some extent on something that might come in the future that might be greater impact, but in the meantime, they get the content, they get the Premier League gets access to all the Sky Sports subscribers, Sky Sports, BT Sports, even Amazon to some extent gets the content and the matches that they want for Amazon, particularly around Christmas, without any additional stress and without any potentially newcomers coming in and stealing their position to some extent.
I mean, 4.7 billion across those 3 years. Whereabouts does that peg with where you would put it?
I mean, it's really difficult to speculate. It's whatever people are willing to pay for it, right? I mean, to some extent, we're always seeing the TV revenues getting squeezed. Obviously, TV advertising revenues, as viewing heads away from it, are always going to go down somewhat. So, the broadcasters and the pay TV players, to some extent as well, are feeling the pressure. So there's only it's not like a bottomless pit of money that they can keep digging into to get to keep funding the Premier rights. But I mean, as I said, like it's in 3 years' time, who knows what it's going to be like? Maybe there'll be someone like a much larger tech player will come in and or Amazon decides to buy a greater portion of the rights if they find them to be particularly successful. So it's very difficult to say because it's always the value is always relative, I suppose.
And how much do we think, guys? And Nick, I'll come back to you first. How much do we think this is a wait and see situation? Is there enough data out there at the moment to really understand how live football, live sport are going to be monetized in the mid 2020s, which is where this gets us to, or are we still going to be in a transitional phase at that point?
I feel like we will still be in a transitional phase, but as we've seen in the US, and the US is always a bit of a barometer for what the European markets should keep an eye out for, and the proliferation and acceleration of how streaming and OTT is taking hold and being adopted is, I think, what we've got to keep an eye out for. Now, we haven't seen a big major OTT player come in to make a bid because whether or not they were allowed to, I'm not sure. Those conversations were clearly had, but I'm sure in 3 years' time, I can only imagine depending on who's around the corner, the DAZNs, the Disney Pluses, the now Discoveries, etc., will all be very keen to have those conversations because adoption of OTT and streaming will be much more mature, and so the ability to make buying premium rights like the Premier League count are just going to be more worthwhile than it will be today. So I think it's still going to be I feel like we're still quite a number of years away until OTT and streaming is adopted to the scale that makes it, I guess, a no-brainer for a multitude of streaming platforms to come into the market and start actively, legitimately bidding for Premier League rights. But we're not too far away. And also, what it could do is obviously open the door for the Premier League to consider launching its own OTT platform. I know that's always been talked about for some time, but again, I think once adoption of OTT and streaming as a legitimate platform for the mainstream to consume, SVOD sort of offerings, comes to a point where the Premier League feels ready to make that shift and press the button, they do it, it'll pretty quickly there'll be a serious adoption taken up. Whether that is in 3 years' time or whether in 6 or so forth, that remains to be seen.
Tony, how would you characterize this stopgap? What are they waiting to see in the market? What conditions are we going to see developing over the next 3 years? Is it purely the players who are involved? Will there be a particularly big shift in terms of behaviour and where the value is in the marketplace?
Yeah, I mean, I think Nick's point's very good in terms of the US is always kind of a barometer to some extent of what's to come, as you kind of mentioned. And what we did see in the most recent rights, obviously, we saw a huge increase in the value of the top most popular US sports, like the NFL, MLB, and a few others. What's interesting about that is that part of the reason why the values went up so much, obviously, because the deals are much longer, so they haven't had the reset cycles to get to the level that they should be at or they feel that they should be at. But the other reason that's quite interesting is because a lot of the rights deals right now are including the digital rights within the deal that they've signed. So we've seen that almost all the major OTT services in the US are planning some sort of sports broadcast. So whether it's Disney Plus through ESPN, HBO Max was talking about adding some stuff on, Peacock as well. There's definitely a shift to including more sports content on OTT players. And obviously, these are very well funded OT players from the United States. They can probably afford these rights. Are we going to see something similar in Europe? It's a little bit more difficult to say, just because the European market's much more fragmented, and the individual OTT players might just not have deep enough pockets to do that. But again, we'll see. I guess in 3 years' time, how much the needle has shifted. It could be by that point that some of the pay TV players shift much more to OTT and hence have deeper pockets to do that. So it'll definitely be interesting to see.
Yeah, and there's a bigger point here, which we'll get to in just a sec, about the balance between those 3-year cycles and the 10, 12-year deals that the US major leagues are able to sign domestically. But where does this leave the Premier League in terms of what it's going to try and do overseas? It started last year. It signed a couple of major renewals in international territories. The growth in its last round of right sales exclusively came from overseas sales, because even though it was a different sales process and a different outcome in terms of who ended up buying rights last time because of Amazon's entry, it was similar or slightly lower, I think, in fact, in terms of the yield domestically and what those rights sold for. So what do we think, Tony, about where they're going to try and see some growth internationally, and how they're going to go about that when they're not bound by EU competition law or the remnants of that, and where they might be able to do things differently? Is there an opportunity for them there to look for a long-term partner in a key territory, or does that cut across what they're trying to do, what their sales teams are trying to do in other markets? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely speculative to answer this, but
It's a podcast.
it's definitely true that the international markets are definitely a key growth area for them. Obviously, you've seen massive growth in the Asia Pacific region, huge economic development over there, and also a lot of interest in a lot of these Premier League clubs. I think a lot of the initiatives that they've done recently, like for example, including the nationalities of the players when they introduce them on the, I guess, the match sheet when they show it before the games, that obviously is designed to attract more of an international audience. So wherever there's players from those countries, obviously you expect interest to shoot up somewhat. So it could be that even parts of sub-Saharan Africa at some point might become somewhat of a growth area, albeit still relatively small. Parts of Latin America even potentially. But yeah, they're always looking globally to see where else they can monetize their content.
And do we think? I don't know enough about competition law and the ways in which it's challenged and the ways in which it evolves to give a particularly firm perspective on this. But do we think that there will come any pressure on the existence of this of the 3 year cycle in European sport, or are there still benefits to it in better times, perhaps, and being able to refresh and so forth, that perhaps we'll see something like it persist through the next decade or so?
Yeah, I would say, look, I think if you took a step back and say, who does the 3 year cycle benefit? It benefits the rights holder. It benefits competition a bit, but actually all it does is just drive prices up and drives up a bidding war every 3 years. The fans do not benefit from it, especially in this new era of fragmented rights and fragmented deals being done, where rights are just being broadcast on all sorts of different platforms. The fan doesn't know where to go half the time if they want to watch their favorite team play, because it could be on any one of 3 platforms in this country or more in others. So the longer cycles will ultimately benefit, I think, the fan. It will benefit the rights holder to have the security of the money in place if the demand for the rights aren't to the peak they were, say, several years ago. And ultimately, the security should be enough to keep everyone happy and everyone can build a business around it. The case has always been, when you've got to buy tier 1 rights that are typically quote unquote loss making, but you're buying it as part of a bigger catalog to attract subscribers. If you have to build a strong, successful business in 3 years, typically it's going to take you 2.5, 3 years at least to get up to a maturation point where it starts to pay off. If that comes to a point, if I was going to looking to build a business around this, and I knew that there was a risk in 3 years I could completely lose the heart and soul of my offering, there's incentives not really there for others to come into the market. But if I've got 7 or 8 years to do so, then I'm going to be much more interested. So yeah, I'm not sure about the competition law side of things, but I think it can only really benefit everyone really to go for the longer term packages. Also, with the transition and the transformation of consumption happening right now, is you've got someone like, let's say, a Sky Sports, who can ramp up scale up their streaming and OTT services as adoption comes up and moves more into that direction. So they have the flexibility to sort of ride the wave where they won't get hamstrung if OTT becomes a more prominent property and they're still stuck in their old traditional ways. So I think it's inevitable. I don't know how they're going to overcome it, because if it's in law, then I don't know. That doesn't sound like an easy thing just to get sorted out overnight. So, but I imagine, again, with Premier League's perspective, they now have time to push that agenda and see where it goes.
Yeah, and it's interesting to look at the way Sky Sports specifically have built relationships with their key rights holders in this country, with the Premier League, and to a lesser extent the likes of the ECB, where they've had these very long relationships and they have some confidence that they're going to be able to renew, because they are now unchallenged as the market leader at this point in time. But perhaps there would be others who would like to replicate that. I mean, Tony, what does the market tell you in terms of how broadcasters would respond to that sort of a development, to a change in that particular area?
Yeah, I mean, I think that some broadcasters would probably welcome it, as Nick pointed out. Like, obviously, it allows you to commit a lot more to the development of the program. Even if it is just the studios, the talent you recruit, the contracts you can give them. It can generally, and to some extent, fragmentation is a big problem. If you are a Premier League fan and you want to watch your team, yeah, the fact that you have to subscribe to possibly 3 services to watch any of the games that are televised, it's a bit of a problem. We're seeing like some of this stuff changing to some extent, but it's not quite yet at the tier 1 level. So to some extent, what we've seen that with Nordic Entertainment's Viaplay, what they're trying to do, for example, with Bundesliga and such in new markets such as Poland, where they've secured some pretty long-term deals. I guess it's about if you're a new entrant, you need that anchor. You need that something to pull your subscribers in, and then obviously build the rest of your content around it. Without that, it's again the rug could be pulled out under you from what you're trying to offer your customers. So it's definitely beneficial for the broadcasters for sure.
One element of the Premier League rights sale process that leads us into our bigger topic, or our other big topic for this podcast. If we are going to see a new entrant, it's probably going to be because they will have bought a chunk of BT's sport business. Tony, what was your reaction? We spoke to Min Almoda when just after SportsPro Live when this news broke. We spoke to your colleague Minal, and it was much fresher news. It emerged pretty much overnight at that point. What are we seeing here? Has this been a long time coming? Is this a sign of broader trends in the market? What's behind BT's exit or partial exit? And yeah, what does it tell us about things more broadly?
I think fundamentally there's a bit of a, I don't want to say quite a disconnect, but a bit of a mismatch, for lack of a better word, between the increase in content costs when it comes to sports rights or other content that TV operators need to buy in order to produce an appealing content slate, and that doesn't necessarily marry up with how quickly the revenues are growing for them, whether that be their telecoms revenues or the TV revenues. So in the case of BT specifically, obviously they're a telecoms operator first, and just from looking at some of the, I guess, broader trends, telecoms revenues have not, or just broadly the whole telecoms revenue hasn't gone up as quickly as content costs have, and content costs are always increasing a lot faster than what the companies can make. So what that means is basically you're either putting more of your budget towards these expensive content rights to secure or keep the business afloat, or you have to cut them and place the priorities elsewhere. I think with BT in particular, particularly from a telecom side, there's a big push right now to develop a 5G network. The government's pushing for full fiber deployment around the country. These are additional costs, and perhaps one of the easiest way to cut costs elsewhere in order to fund these projects is to cut out the sports rights, which are generally quite a significant chunk of the cost of their content costs in terms of sports. So that could be definitely a factor, a significant factor with what they considered when they, I guess, indicated that BT Sports could be something that they slowly phase out.
The other side of this is who comes in. I mean, do we would expect, I guess, it will be a media company. It'll be a content company of some description.
Yeah, I mean, again, it could be anyone really. I mean, it could even, who knows? It could be Amazon could decide to buy it and expand their thing. Maybe Apple will join because they do have a lot of they sit on a lot of cash that they could potentially spend. Is it likely that they'll do it? I mean, I think it's probably a little bit early for someone like Apple to look at sports, but it doesn't mean that it's not possible. I think if it was to be another TV player, obviously some people have speculated that it could be ITV, and in which case you could see Premier League return to free to air again. It could be potentially someone even like DAZN coming in and buying BT Sports. Again, there's a lot of possibilities, and I'm sure that BT is talking to all of them.
Help us spread the word about the SportsPro Podcast. Subscribe, like and share our content on social. Join the conversation on Twitter with the hashtag SportsProPod. And if you're enjoying our work, why not leave us a rating and a nice review on your podcast platform of choice? And if you want to get in touch, you can send us an email, podcast@sportspromedia.com. The SportsPro Podcast. We're listening too.
Where this leads us to, big telecoms groups selling up or restructuring their commitments in media. AT&T choosing to merge its WarnerMedia group or its WarnerMedia assets with Discovery. Nick, what was your reaction when you saw that news? There are sports brands in those portfolios. They're maybe 2 or 3 lines down, just reminding us all of our place in the order of things. But it's a pretty extraordinary development, a merger at that scale.
Yeah, I mean, wow. I think, I don't know in terms of where they actually fit in the pecking order of mergers over the years, but I think it's got to be right up there with one of the biggest in the broadcast space that I can think of. And actually, the one before that is probably the AT&T Warner Media one beforehand, which was I think $80 billion as well. And I remember we were over actually at the Turner Sports studios in Atlanta a little over 12 months ago, and they were just in this transition phase, rebranding all the Turner stuff to WarnerMedia, and now they've got to go and do it all over again. So quite a crazy time in those respective businesses, even up until this merger point. But I mean, this has huge repercussions. And I think what's quite interesting to see, obviously, these businesses or these organizations have such strong US roots. The thing for me is, what impact is it going to have internationally? What does it mean for other markets where they don't have a foothold or a position yet? Obviously, Discovery has been rolling out its Discovery Plus option since I think was it January this year. They're about to launch their sports offering with the Olympics coming up as their sort of kicking off point. And what does it mean for all the rest of the AT&T and WarnerMedia business, and things like HBO Max, and whether or not that's going to be expanding out into new markets? So there's a lot of question marks, but what it means really is other markets, I think, will start getting more of what they're serving in the US, as they have such a huge catalog of content. And I think they've sprouted out the number that they're going to be spending something like $20 billion a year on original content or on content moving forward, which is more than Netflix, which is, I think, an important line for them to have in their press release. So, a huge transformational moment to build one of, if not the biggest broadcast players in the marketplace, full stop.
Yeah, so there's lots that we don't know, as you say. We don't know anything about the branding and what they're going to be scrubbing off or painting onto those walls at the Turner Sports Studios.
And neither do they, apparently, from the press from the session, the press conference. Yeah,
but we do know that some of those discussions have been happening. What we know in concrete terms is that this deal will be structured as an all-stock reverse Morris Trust transaction. AT&T receiving $43 billion in a combination of cash, debt securities, and WarnerMedia's retention of certain debt. AT&T shareholders will get 71% of the new company. Discovery will get 29% of the new company. But there's two things that are quite telling about the deal. Kind of, David Zaslav is going to take over, and Discovery has been on this accumulation path for some time. Tony, they bought Eurosport, obviously. I think back in 2014 they completed that takeover. I could be wrong, but it was a kind of two-part process. They also bought Scripps a couple of years ago to become the biggest unscripted entertainment. I can't remember their exact positioning, but it's documentaries and reality TV and sports is the area where they see themselves leading. And then you have a very diversified media business with Warner. This is definitely part of a trend, though, Tony. This aggregation of big media companies.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that again, it just comes down to, I guess, the shift from, I guess, a more TV centric to a more OTT centric space, and to some extent, scale really matters because you have new OTT players that have come out of nowhere, and they're serious competitors for all these companies. So inevitably, you're going to see consolidation in the market as the media players, need to find the scale to compete to some extent. And with Discovery and WarnerMedia, it's quite an interesting one because they're not necessarily direct competitors. They're quite complementary to some extent. And as Nick alluded to, obviously their content spend is likely to exceed what Netflix is spending every year. But crucially, it won't necessarily be the biggest player. Like Disney's still bigger. A hypothetical Comcast, Viacom, CBS, joint merged entity would be even bigger. So they're not going to be like the largest, fish in the sea, so to speak. But it does mean that they have a lot more. They're sitting on a lot more content, and to some extent, especially when we're going through a transition period, it might be quite important for them to have scale. And when they negotiate with the TV players for the renewals of retransmission fees or whatever, because as the market becomes smaller, obviously they're going to want to pay less. But if they hold all the channels, all the content, then they hold a much stronger negotiating position. And yeah, it is obviously perhaps a bit of a more difficult situation for the platforms, but ultimately for these guys, they need the scale to ensure their survival to some extent.
And that comes to bear in a couple of ways. One being the acquisition of content or the spend on original content or rights, which we'll get to in just a sec. And the other is the potentially loss-making position that new digital services are going to put organizations in. I mean, you have to spend a lot of money to get to the point where Disney have got, to create a subscription proposition that is attractive enough to however many tens of millions of people they've now got Disney Plus out to. Yeah, you've got to be able to find resources to support that kind of development.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it is ultimately, as you mentioned, a very challenging business to be in, because a lot of these large tech companies that are looking to expand into this space, they're not looking to make an absolute profit from operating in the video space, which makes it very difficult for those companies that do need to make a profit to operate. So, when you think of someone like arguably like Apple or Amazon, their primary source of income is not from their video, it's from their e-commerce or it's from their device sales. And when you have to compete with someone like that, it makes it a lot more difficult. Hence why the scale and the negotiating position matters so much more, because if you sit on a ton of content and you have a much stronger position in the market, you can secure yourself a much neater and a more generous size of the pie to ensure that you can do well in the future.
And I guess, Nick, the two things that this perhaps indicates, one is maybe less of a fear of monopolistic practices being challenged, given that these companies will point to the fact that Netflix is a unique player in the space that they've got to compete with, and the other is the need to in a digital era to achieve more of a global scale. And we've talked about Apple and what their entry to sport might look like, but you would imagine it would be pretty international in its scope. Would you say that's fair? That these are the other challenges that these groups have got to think about?
Yeah, I mean, that's always going to be a question mark on these types of deals at this scale. But I think what this sort of deal does and what they will point to is the global opportunities that these broadcasters have really only scratched the surface on growing outside of the US market. And so I think quite easily they'll be able to say we're only an entry player in a lot of new markets. So despite being the scale that this deal is outside of the US, it's only early days for a lot of them, and the consolidation is essential to be able to compete with the likes of a Netflix and others in those respective domestic markets. And quite frankly, again, I mentioned it earlier, but I think consolidation. Well, I said fragmentation is not a good thing for fans and consumers, but consolidation will be. If as a consumer, you want to know where you want to go for content, and if these guys all start consolidating what they're doing, I think that's only going to make consumers happier, that they know where to go to watch their favorite TV show and favorite live sports content, etc. So I think it's a great thing for everyone involved to see these types of deals happening, and I'd expect that we will start to see probably more to happen. I don't know why a business of this scale will stop here. There's every chance that they can continue to merge and find other media businesses to bring in, and maybe again, it's always these what ifs, but maybe this is the opportunity that someone like DAZN would relish, because they would plug into this sort of dynamic and model really, really well, particularly if these businesses are looking to grow in non-US markets, because obviously DAZN's marketplace isn't strong, and DAZN has been positioning themselves for most people are expecting them to either SPAC or try and go public in the coming months, years, etc. So who knows, that sort of thing could be on the horizon as well.
And this rolling up, Tony, of media companies, it's been happening for a while. Disney, as you said, became an enormous. I mean, they were always a huge entertainment group, but they bought assets from Lucasfilm and Marvel, and then subsequently Fox, and on they've gone. See, their operations in India are now pretty substantial. We've seen Comcast buying Sky. We've seen just this week a couple of other reports coming out on the entertainment side. Amazon buying MGM, or being in talks to buy MGM for $9 billion. And in France, TF1 and M6, or TF1 and M6 for our English-speaking audience, looking to create a $4 billion merger, 3.4 billion euro merger. Where are the limits to this? What's Nick has talked about the benefits from a consumer perspective, but where are some of the risks in this kind of accumulation?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's always going to be associated risks, and there's always going to be prices that are simply too much to pay. I mean, earlier this year, there was rumors going around that MGM was trying to sell itself to Apple for 5 billion, and the fact to see now that they're now going to sell themselves to Amazon for nearly double that, just really goes to show you how valuable intellectual property is, and particularly the the really popular content that's available through each one of these studios. In terms of, I guess, where the limit is in terms of how much they can they can keep merging. I mean, you ultimately still need a couple of players in the market. You can't have the ultimate consolidation, but as kind of alluded to, as everything shifts to being more online based, more OTT based, you could argue that the TV players are it's naturally going to be there's going to be fewer of them, and it might be enough that, for example, there'll be just one or two major commercial broadcasters in the nation, and then that'll be fine. But again, it really depends. In France, TV advertising revenues haven't been as pressured as they have been in other countries. So we've actually seen them grow up until the pandemic hit, albeit it was very modest growth. They weren't declining. So in some countries that's still a viable business and they're still doing well. But obviously the fact that they're not growing quite as quickly as the content costs are, or the inflation of the content costs are due to OTT, means that inevitably they need to merge, optimize their costs, and ultimately be able to put more of that towards new content, original content, and things that will ultimately attract viewers.
Let's talk a bit about what this means for rights holders, what it means for the sports businesses within this merger. First of all, this AT&T, WarnerMedia, and Discovery merger, and then just to wrap up, looking at the picture for rights holders more generally. There are mostly American businesses, as you said, Nick, on the Warner side, looking at TNT, Turner Sports, and then on the Discovery side, it's mostly outside the US, Eurosport and GolfTV, which is, while it's a global service, is a mostly external to the US because the key rights are owned by a different player there. What are your thoughts? I mean, we don't know very much, and we're certainly not going to be told very much at this stage about what the play would be on the sports side here. But what was your reaction in that respect?
Well, looking at some of the businesses within, say, WarnerMedia, they've obviously got Turner Sports, who have a host of major sports rights. They run platforms. I think like they run the NBA's platform. They have Bleacher Report. They have they run NCAA.com, NBA.com. They have other websites that they run for sports properties. They're one of the major, I would say, players in the sports marketplace. And again, integrating Turner Sports into the HBO Max or Discovery offering more deeply, again, will add a lot more value for subscribers potentially to be attracted to it. But I think more widely, I mean, what it opens the opportunity. The biggest challenge I think for sports is we always want to see those global deals being done for sports rights, and quite frankly, they're just never achievable because of the fragmentation of sports rights. Market by market, deals are done. And to wrap up all of those deals is near on impossible in the short term. The best example of that is GolfTV, where the PGA Tour did that landmark deal with Discovery, and also European Tour was involved with that for over $1 billion to ingest all of the media rights outside of the US, and they could either sublicense those rights in those markets or bring them into the GolfTV platform. This just gives them a further opportunity to, if that model is something that they believe in, then the opportunity is that they could absolutely look to replicate that for other sports properties, particularly ones that have a global footprint or global reach. Tennis could be an obvious example, could be with Formula One. Who knows? There's plenty out there. So I like the opportunity that having a truly global kind of media player, once as Discovery's tentacles and subscribers internationalize and globalize, what it could be as a platform for sports, to be able to finally find a global international home that actually is legitimate and not just a fragmented approach in their rights. Pardon me. So, yeah, I think that for me is perhaps the most exciting thing to see if that does come to fruition.
Just to pick up on that, I mean, the two biggest deals, I suppose, that are affected by this, but that could have where there could be some interesting implications on distribution and on the on the original programming side and all sorts of other things. The NBA deal with Turner, it's approaching its renewal point, but that was a very long-term deal of 12 years signed in the mid-2010s. And the Discovery deal, Tony, with the IOC for the Olympic Games is the one that looks most different from the rest, I guess, in terms of what's in WarnerMedia's wheelhouse historically, and the kinds of deals that they're used to doing, because Discovery made a lot of their money on that deal, or have made a lot of their money on that deal so far, by sub-licensing rights to free-to-air players in the territories involved. They've not shown very much of the Olympics yet because we've only had one, and one was delayed. But I'm sure there is a longer-term content play that involves all of their other platforms and the other routes they have to an audience. But what do you think? What's the future of that deal look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're really hitting it. Like, you really brought up a very good point there, which is that even though Discovery did have a global rights to the Olympics, they still ended up sub-licensing a lot of the content. And part of the reason is because not every single the sports preferences between the various countries vary greatly. In some countries, this a particular sport will be by far the most popular. In other parts, it won't be. And so, for someone to go in and spend a very large amount of money for a global play, hoping that, I don't know, everyone was going to enjoy watching American football, they might struggle to sell their service in Europe. Obviously, there's still some dedicated American football fans in the European continent, but it's never going to be a mass market play the way, for example, a Premier League OTT service would be in the UK. And that's kind of the fundamental problem. Like, you can get the global rights, but ultimately, that those rights tend to be perhaps the slightly more niche, or perhaps slightly less popular sports, where there is a strong passionate base that is willing to pay. So, something like, some of the martial arts that the DAZN has secured, that really makes a lot of sense. The Olympics, you could argue, is one of the most international competitions. But even with the Olympics, they still sub-licensed it to make more money out of it. And ultimately, I think that's kind of really summarizes the problem, really, that sports, the popularity of sports will vary greatly by region and country, and also fundamentally the value of sports, that you get to watch it live. And because you're talking about a global distribution, what is live somewhere is 3 in the morning somewhere else. So it's very difficult for someone to sell the same rights to some top tier competitions in Asia when they're broadcasted in the evening live in the US. The time differences also cause a bit of a problem there. So there's many things to consider, and that's part of the reason why I think that we're not necessarily going to see a huge commitment from any individual player to acquire any single competition globally, at least not for the next 5 years or so.
We're about to run out of time, but just to wrap up quickly, I mean, what are your thoughts on what this means for the market vertically, basically from top to bottom? I think almost any news ends up being good news for the big players. But what do we think it means for rights holders across the spectrum that we're seeing this kind of consolidation on the media side?
It's definitely interesting to see. I mean, in the short term, you could assume that they would have slightly deeper pockets to invest into sports rights with, to try and get new subscribers. In the long term, again, provided their business works, that could be very beneficial. But equally, from the other perspective, a lack of competition will inevitably drive the prices down. If BT Sport exited the market completely, let's say tomorrow, and Sky Sports becomes the only bidder for Premier League, or the only serious bidder, for lack of a better word, I mean, then at that point, inevitably the valuations will go down. So consolidation is not necessarily a good thing after a certain point. I think, again, what we're seeing at the moment is still leaves healthy competition in the market. But if it gets down to too few players, you could imagine something where the prices are just artificially held lower down than they should be.
Yeah, I think rights, the tier one sports properties will always drive value. So they will always be able to gain premium media rights values relatively close to what they have been historically. For the tier two and tier three sports properties underneath those, the markets has always been a challenging landscape for them. And for them, the only way they can really navigate it, I think, is the adoption of OTT and direct to consumer for themselves to create their own platforms. Now, potentially, as we see big OTT players like what they're building here in this deal could become a home for some of these tier 2 and tier 3 sports properties to be almost a carrier for some of their OTT platforms, in the same way that they'll be doing that for the Global Cycling Network, and they'll do that for Golf TV and so on. So I see that as an opportunity as we continue to expand, and there's a need for content. That's an opportunity. But for the foreseeable future, I don't see tier 1 sports I don't think need to be particularly excited about it. They just need to know that it's the landscape shifting yet again, and they've got some different people to perhaps talk to negotiate their deals than they did a few years ago.
Well, lots to keep an eye on over the next few months and over the next few years. But for now, that is it for this SportsPro podcast. Thank you very much to Tony Maroulis.
Thank you very much.
And to Nick Meacham.
Cheers, Owen.
Thanks to all of you for listening as ever, and we will be back with you again very soon. Bye-bye.
The SportsPro podcast is published by SportsPro Media. The producer is Ed Dixon.